Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class hour. We are continuing our study of the book of Mark. We're going to be spending some time in chapter 15. See if you can hear me a little bit better if I move that up. How's that? A little better? Okay. There are handouts in the back, just right outside the glass doors here, if you'd like to get one of those. Just as a reminder before we get started, this is almost the end of our study on Mark. This is the second to last class, so Sunday next week will be our final class. So if you've not looked at any Bible classes for Sunday morning starting the next quarter, so 2 Sundays from now, please go ahead and do that. There are registration forms in the foyer. You can also do that on light posts. So remember, we're almost done with this, but we're glad you're here this morning joining us as we study the book of Mark. Let's go ahead and go to God in a word of prayer before we begin. Father God, we thank you so much for this time to be able to gather together to open up your word, to learn from it. God, we ask that you bless our time as we look at the life of your Son, as we look at the very end of his life before and including the crucifixion that he endured for us. God, we are so grateful for him, so grateful that he took that punishment on our behalf. God, bless us as we try to learn from that event and what it means for our lives. God, we love you, and we pray this in his name. Amen. So Mark chapter 15, this covers really kind of what we think of as the final hours of Jesus' life, at least leading up to his death. He still was alive on earth after that when he rose from the dead and was seen by many of his disciples, many of his followers. But the last several hours leading up to that event, that's what Mark chapter 15 covers. So a couple of things before we really get into some of the details I want to look at. Mark gives us just a couple of interesting things to think about and consider for this event. The first one I want to look at is just the timeline. Mark is the only gospel account that gives us kind of a definitive timeline of when some of these things happened. He's very specific. So verse 1 said, as soon as it was morning, that's when the chief priests got together and when they led him off to Pilate. So just for our own context, the morning, daylight, would have been about 6 a.m. for these people, right? As soon as it was morning, as soon as it was daylight. If you remember at the end of chapter 14, the very last thing in there is about Peter denying Jesus before the rooster crows 2 times, right? Well, rooster crows in the morning when the sun comes up. So this is kind of right after these events take place that Jesus has been before the council. They're hauling him off now. This is first thing in the morning. John talked last week about how they needed Judas to lead them in the dark to where Jesus was. Well, they've done all of this at nighttime. Well, now it's morning, and they're hauling him off to Pilate. Next, it tells us, verse 25, it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. So 3rd hour from the morning. So if the morning is 6 a.m., about 9 o'clock is when they nailed him to a cross and raised him up. And then verses 33 and 34, it tells us a couple more time points. The 6th hour and the 9th hour, between that, there was darkness over the land. The 9th hour was when Jesus called out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? And at that point in time is when we're told he cried out and breathed his last breath, and he gave up his spirit. That's when he died. So 6th hour would have been about noon, 9th hour, 3 o'clock. So Mark is giving us some very specific details about the timeline of when all of this happened. We don't find that in the other Gospels. The last thing I want to note is verse 42. So it talks about when the evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. Something I want you to understand about a Jewish 24-hour day, it actually starts the evening before. So when night falls the day before, that's when the day starts. So if Jesus was crucified on a Friday, that evening when night fell on what we would think of as Friday evening, that was really the beginning of the Sabbath. So if we take all of these into account, this idea that first thing in the morning, about 6 a.m., Jesus is brought before Pilate, the council hauls him off, and then he goes through all the things that he went through. We'll look at a lot of that. Up until the evening when it had come, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, when Joseph of Arimathea wants to claim his body. This all happens in about a 12-hour window, is what I want you to see here. About 12 hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. when evening would have come, when nightfall would have come, before the Sabbath, when it hit that evening point, Sabbath day, all the Jews would have had to rest. So 12 hours leading up to that. That's not a detail that we find in other gospel accounts. Another thing that we see is Mark gives us a whole lot of information about an eyewitness just in verse 21 alone, when he tells us about Simon of Cyrene. So first thing, he gives us an origin. He tells us where Simon is from. So Cyrene, if you were to look for it on a map today, it is in modern-day Libya. Straight line distance between Cyrene and Jerusalem is just under 800 miles. To put that in context for us, if you think about traveling in a straight line from Houston to Tampa, Florida, it's on par. It's pretty close, right? That's a long ways, especially if you're traveling the way Simon of Cyrene would have done back in his day. Mark also gives us a unique identifier about this man. He tells us who his sons are, Alexander and Rufus. This was a real man. This was somebody that you could go inquire about. You know where he's from. If you were to show up to Cyrene asking about Simon, somebody says, well, which one? There's a lot of Simons around here. Oh, his sons are Alexander and Rufus. You can find this man. You can go talk to him about what happened. And then the last thing, it tells us his role. It tells us what he was doing there. He was just a passerby. He was uninvolved with the situation. He had no bias one way or the other. He was just a guy in the crowd that they grabbed and said, here, Jesus can't carry this cross anymore, you do it. He wasn't involved with the decision of the council. He wasn't involved with Pilate's decision to hand him over. He was just somebody there that saw what was going on, that knew what happened to Jesus. And Mark tells us about this man. The letter that Mark is writing, his readers, they would have been able to go inquire. They would have been able to go ask Simon of Cyrene if they wanted to find out about him, if they wanted to go figure out where he was. They could have asked him if all these details were true. Hey, Mark wrote us this letter. Is this really what happened, Simon? Is this what you saw? Is this the account that you can tell us? So just a couple of unique, interesting details that Martin gives us to show credibility to his story. We need to understand that what happened to Jesus, this account that takes place in Mark chapter 15, is real and it's true. It's verifiable. We have a timeline of events. We have an eyewitness who can tell us, yes, this is what happened. This is what took place. So the next thing I want to consider is some things that we see with Jesus. The first is the silence of Jesus. At the very beginning of the chapter, verse 4, Pilate is basically asking Jesus, why won't he defend himself? The chief priests, they've brought him before Pilate, and they've made all kinds of false accusations against him. If we remember from chapter 14, they've got several of their own eyewitnesses that they can't agree on the same story. They can't agree on the same crimes that Jesus has committed. So they're false witnesses. They're not telling the same story. Pilate sees this. He knows that they're telling a bunch of bad things about Jesus. And he said, why won't you defend yourself? Why won't you say anything? Verse 4, then Pilate asks him again, do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you. And Jesus just didn't answer him. And the question is why? Why did Jesus not defend himself? He was in the right. He had not sinned. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why didn't he defend himself? I think the very simple answer here is He did it to fulfill prophecy. If you look at Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Sometimes I think we know that there are messianic prophecies in the Bible about the Christ, about Jesus, and what he came to do, what was going to happen to him, but we don't stick with those a whole lot. And I think it's very important that we understand messianic prophecies are very, very important. If Jesus had deviated from a messianic prophecy, he would not have been the Messiah. If Jesus had not fulfilled this one prophecy, even if he had fulfilled every other one about the Messiah, if he hadn't fulfilled this one, he wouldn't have been the Messiah. So when we ask that question, why didn't Jesus defend himself? I think a very simple answer is that he had to. He had to stay silent. God said that's what was going to happen, that he was going to go quietly. He was going to allow this to happen. But consider for a moment things that Jesus might have said if he had spoken. If Jesus had defended himself, if he had said something to Pilate, if he had addressed these false accusations, whatever he would have said would have been truthful, wouldn't it? John 18:37, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. That's because Jesus always speaks the truth. Jesus never lied in his entire life. He was a sinless man. He never messed up once. He didn't even tell a white lie. He always spoke the truth. And if he'd have defended himself that day, whatever he would have said would have been truthful. It would have been powerful. It could have been powerful. Matthew 26, verse 53, this is a parallel account to Jesus in the garden when he's being arrested. Remember, his disciples wanted to fight for him. And he addresses them and says, if I ask God, he'd send down 12 legions of angels. It says more than 12 legions of angels. He could have just called help down from heaven. He wouldn't have had to deal with any of this. If Jesus wanted to have defended himself, he could have. Make no mistake, there would have been something he could have done to prevent all of this from happening. Whatever he would have said would have been intended for salvation. Luke chapter 19, verse 10. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That was his purpose here on earth. Imagine how that conversation would have gone if Jesus is before the council, he's before Pilate, and they're making up all these false accusations, and all Jesus wants to do, the only thing he wants to say is intended to save all of these people. Wouldn't have that been a fascinating conversation? To convince every single one of those council members, to convince Pilate that what he's about to do, sending Jesus off, was not right, and to save Pilate himself. That would have been a fascinating conversation, wouldn't it? I can't imagine what he would have said, but he could have done it. He could have convinced everybody in that room that he was innocent, that he was righteous, that he didn't deserve to die. But he didn't do it. Anything Jesus would have said, anything he could have said would have been good and it would have been righteous. But to fulfill prophecy, he stayed silent. He let it happen. On top of that, we remember from chapter 14 of Mark that the council had already made up his mind. It seems like Pilate had also kind of done that as well. Maybe they wouldn't have listened. They already knew what they wanted to do to Jesus. They already knew that they wanted to kill him. They wanted to make him suffer. So Jesus kept quiet. Any questions or comments before we move on? Yes, sir.
It's extremely difficult. I don't know how he did it. To face that kind of scrutiny and just slander, and knowing that he is God. nothing wrong, but the passage that comes to mind for me is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 following. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you may follow in his steps. He committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. I don't know how he did it. I've been in situations where people maybe saying things and I pop back off. He's just a perfect Savior.
So Justin's making a good point, one I'm actually going to make in a little bit. He doesn't know how Jesus could have done that. Bring up 1 Peter chapter 2, which we are going to look at that in just a little bit. But how in the world, Jesus knowing that he is God, how does he do this? How does he stay silent? How does he be so passive in what he's doing? Yes, ma'am.
Well, he had just been talking to his father for an hour, so I assume God had told him what was going to happen, and which probably has done quite worse.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next one. Everybody's just teaching my class for me. Did I email everybody notes? Is that what happened? Good job doing homework ahead of time. I appreciate it. So Jesus was also very, very submissive in this story, isn't he? Now think for a moment, Jesus was the most powerful human that ever lived on this planet. Do you understand that? The most powerful human that has ever lived on this planet. And the reason is because Jesus was God incarnate on this earth. Any person that you can think of, living or dead, any Bible character that you can read about, all of them paled in comparison to what Jesus could do. Think about what he could do with just a word. Just from the book of Mark alone. Mark chapter 2, he healed the paralytic. And remember what he said? Rise, take up your bed, and walk. That's all he had to do. He just spoke. Chapter 4, he calmed the storm. He said, peace be still. Right? A raging storm. And all of a sudden, the wind stopped, the sea calmed. It wasn't a gradual, okay, everything's just kind of slowing down and coming to a stop. No, it stopped, it ceased. As soon as he said those words, everything was calm. One of my favorite stories out of Mark chapter 5, the man with a legion of unclean spirits. Right? A man who was living off by himself, and he would break chains. Nobody could bind him. He was a man that everybody was afraid to be around. Jesus gave those unclean spirits permission to leave that man and go into a herd of pigs. They asked if they could do that, and he said yes. He gave them permission, right? A man that had a legion of unclean spirits. Mark chapter 5, when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, you remember what he said to her? He walked up, grabbed her by the hand. Little girl, I say to you, arise. He grabbed on her just to help her out of bed. All he had to do was speak to her, just talk to her. That's how much power Jesus had. And in Mark chapter 15, we read about how submissive he was. Jesus allowed himself to be a lot of things. He allowed a lot of things to happen to him. Take a look. Oh, that's too many. Take a look at that list for just a moment. Look at those words, things that happened to Jesus. He allowed himself to be bound, to be struck, to be blasphemed and reviled. Right? Back to Justin's point, how could Jesus have just sat there and let this happen if he knew he was God, if he knew he was righteous, he had done no wrong? How could he just let these things happen? One thing that comes to my mind is the story of Samson. Right? Delilah, we remember that story. She's trying to trick him. She's trying to get him bound and hand him over to the Philistines. And a couple of times they bind him, and he just breaks his bonds. I think about that story because I think Jesus could have done that, couldn't he? Even if he let them bind him and he's being led to Pilate, if he really wanted to, couldn't he have just done that, walked away? He could have. He was that powerful. We don't so much think about Jesus' physical strength, but if he wanted to do that, he absolutely could have. We need to remember that Jesus was, in a physical sense, he was submitting to these men, but more importantly, he was submitting to God's will. So Sandy's point, thank you, Sandy. Mark chapter 14, verse 36. As Jesus is praying to God, he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. He has prayed this prayer to God the evening before, and now he's following through with it. He is submitting to God. And in this case, submitting to God meant submitting to these men, to allow all of these things to happen to him. Even though he was God, even though he was all-powerful, even though he can make all of this stop with a word. That's how submissive Jesus Christ was in this chapter. Please, please understand that. This one is hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around sometimes, because if this kind of injustice happened to us, I think for the most part our initial reaction, our response would be to rail against that injustice. If it was you or me, I think we would have a hard time being silent, right? If I was accused of some great crime and I know that somebody is about to punish me and kill me, and I knew it wasn't true, I'd be saying something. I'd be screaming and shouting, trying to get somebody to listen to me. I would be thrashing, trying to get away. That's not what Jesus did. He was silent and he was submissive to what was happening. Think about Galatians chapter 5 for just a moment. The fruit of the Spirit. With the exception of joy, because I don't think Jesus found very much joy in this event. But all the other ones, love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and gentleness, self-control, I think Jesus displayed every single one of those. Again, besides joy, Jesus demonstrated all of those qualities. Think about that the next time you read the account of Jesus being led away. The next time you read Mark chapter 15 or one of the other gospel accounts. When we study the fruit of the Spirit, we tend to look at this list and then we go to somewhere else in the Bible to try to figure out, okay, what is love? What does that really mean? What does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to have self-control? We start looking at other passages. Do you know what the next verse says? Those who belong to Jesus Christ have been crucified, or have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. It's interesting to me that when Paul is writing these words, when he's thinking about the old man that you should be getting rid of, starting around verse 19, I think, all of the qualities you should be crucifying and then all of the qualities you should be taking on, he relates that back to crucifixion. We're not going to spend a lot of time looking at all of that this morning, but I encourage you, when you're studying this, it's an interesting idea. Think about the crucifixion of Jesus in the context of Galatians 5 for a moment. The fruit of the Spirit and what Jesus displayed. Think about when he was peaceful during all of this. The kindness that he showed by being led away, by being silent and submissive. There's a lot in there to think about and to ponder. All right, any other questions before we move on to the next one? Yes, sir, Woodrow.
I think I have this right. I know it's in Hebrew. Does it say that George said before he went to the cross?
Yeah, well,
The joy set before Jesus, he went to the cross.
the joy set before Jesus, he went to the cross. What was that verse, that passage?
Hebrews 12:2.
Hebrews 12:2. So there you go. There's joy. There's the last one. Okay, moving on. The suffering that Jesus endured, the suffering that he experienced. There was a lot, to put it simply. Jesus experienced much, much suffering. So in this chapter, the first thing was verse 15, when Pilate scourges him. Just so we understand what that means. Pilate had him scourged before he was released to the mob, before he was released to the crowd. That means he was beaten with a whip. Probably had more than one tail on it. And that whip would have had pieces of bone, pieces of metal. Would not have been a pleasant time, to say the least. That's what Pilate did before he released him to the crowd to be crucified. He had him beaten with this whip. He was scourged before the actual suffering took place, if we could say that. He was tortured and mocked at the governor's palace. So when Pilate releases him, he's taken to the governor's palace, and there is a battalion of men. It was about 600 or so. They torture him some more. They mock him. They laugh at him. This is where he is given a crown of thorns. They place it on his head, and then they take a reed and they beat on his head while he's got that crown of thorns on there. So he's already been scourged. Now he's being beaten a little bit more, and they're making fun of him. They're spitting on him. In jest, they're kneeling down, paying homage to the king. And then he hung on the cross for about 6 hours. So verse 25 of Mark 15, this is again where we're told it was the third hour of the day, and they crucified him when they put him on the cross. And then if you skip down to verse 34, it's when it tells us about at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And then verse 39, so when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last. 6 hours hanging on a cross. Understand that capital punishment back in these days was very different than today. The end goal was very different than what we think of. And somebody is undergoing capital punishment in our society when they're on death row and they're finally executed. We try to make sure that they go quietly and painlessly. That's the law of the land here. The Romans, death was not the end goal. Suffering and punishment was the end goal. They wanted to make it last. They wanted to draw out punishment. 6 hours on a cross sounds like a long time to us, doesn't it? If you look at verse 44, when Joseph of Arimathea has come to ask Pilate for the body, Pilate is surprised that he is dead already. Pilate is surprised that after only 6 hours, Jesus is dead. He expected him to be there longer than that. So all of this suffering that Jesus went through, why? Why did he have to do that? Why wasn't the beating enough? Or why did he have to go through the beating and the crucifixion? Why? All right, God, if the Christ really needs to suffer, why can't it just be the cross? Why does it have to be all these other things too? Again, for one, it was to fulfill prophecy. We're not going to open up to all of these, but Acts chapter 3, verse 18, Peter is preaching on Solomon's portico. And that verse says, "But what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would suffer, he thus fulfilled." So Peter is recounting these events. He's telling these people what happened and why Jesus had to suffer. One was because of prophecy. Luke 24, Jesus is risen from the dead, and he's with some disciples on the road to Emmaus. And he tells them, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" In verse 27, starting with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted the scriptures concerning himself. So even Jesus knew this is what the prophecy was, that he needed to suffer as the Christ to fulfill prophecy. He needed to suffer in order to sanctify us with his blood. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12. "So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood." We remember that every week when we partake in the Lord's Supper, right? When we do communion. The body and the blood. And whoever's up here saying the prayer, we mention that, what the blood is for. To sanctify us, to wash away our sins. Jesus had to suffer so that his blood could do that for us. To bring us closer to God. It's another reason Jesus had to suffer the way that he did. 1 Peter 3:18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, him for us." Read it that way. Christ also suffered once for sins, him for us, that he might bring us to God. That's why he had to suffer. That's why he had to die the way that he did, to bring us closer to God. And then again, to be an example for us. So we mentioned this a little bit earlier. 1 Peter 2, verse 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." If this one sounds familiar to you, this is one of the kids sing songs that kids have learned on Sunday night. Do you know this is what we're teaching them about? Christ suffered to be an example for us. We may not ever have to suffer the same way that he did, but that's what we were called to. That's the example that he set before us. Jesus had to suffer. It was part of the plan. It's not the plan I would have come up with, but it doesn't matter what my plan is. It doesn't matter your plan. This is God's plan. This is what had to happen. Any other comments? There's a lot going on in Mark chapter 15, huh? A lot of things to think about, consider. All right, the last thing I want to look at is two other individuals. Let's think about Pilate for just a moment. It's always very interesting to me when there's a person in a biblical story that gets mentioned by name. Typically, I always think about it's mostly either because this was somebody that did something really good or somebody that did something really bad, and they're getting mentioned by name either for a really good reason or a really bad reason. But Pilate is mentioned by name. He's an important character in this story. He's an important person in all of these events. Consider for a moment some of the things that Pilate did. He knew that the chief priests were envious of Jesus. Mark 15, verse 10 tells us that explicitly. He knew that they were envious. He knew that the false accusations that they brought of Jesus before him were indeed false. He knew they weren't telling the truth. But he allowed them to stand anyway, didn't he? He allowed it to happen. He let it go. In this sense, Pilate compromised the truth, didn't he? He compromised the truth about Jesus, knowing what they were saying was not true, and he allowed them to stand anyway. Pilate also knew that Jesus was innocent. Turn over to Luke 23, verse 22 for just a moment. I think this one is very, very interesting. Luke 23, verse 22. So another parallel account of what's going on. Pilate knew for sure that Jesus was innocent. He could not find any charges against him. Luke 23, verse 22, Pilate said a third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death." 3 times he said to these people, "There's nothing wrong with this man. He hasn't done anything wrong." He knew Jesus was innocent. He knew that, and he tried to say it over and over and over again. But what did he do? Look at the end of verse 22 there in Luke 23. "I will therefore punish and release him." He punished an innocent man and released a criminal instead. The crowd called out for Barabbas, somebody that they knew was a bad guy, a known criminal. Pilate asked, "Who do you want me to release to you, Jesus or Barabbas?" "Do you want me to release Jesus, a man who I know is innocent? I've tried to tell you. Or do you want me to release a man who we know is a criminal, we know has done some horrendous things?" Remember, Barabbas was part of an uprising. And he punished the innocent man. He punished Jesus. In this manner, Pilate compromised justice, didn't he? He compromised justice, knowing that he was sending an innocent man off to his death, and he was letting a criminal go, a true criminal go. Back to Mark chapter 15, verse 15. He wanted to satisfy the crowd. That's what it says at the end of, or in verse 15. Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them and delivered Jesus. The reason that he wanted to do that was to satisfy the crowd. So that's exactly what he did. Matthew's account tells us that there was a riot that was about to begin, or that was starting to begin. And Pilate, as the ruler, he probably didn't want to deal with that, huh? So to quell that riot, he gave the people what they wanted. He satisfied them. He released Barabbas and he handed over Jesus. And he compromised righteousness, didn't he? That wasn't the right thing to do. To satisfy a mob, to satisfy people that were about to begin a riot, just to get it over with, just to make it go away, that's not the right thing to do. I think it's interesting some of the things that Pilate did, some of his actions. I think those are important to consider. I think it's also important to consider that against Joseph of Arimathea. So in Mark, we read about him starting in verse 43. Mark tells us that he is a respected member of the council. Luke 23, if you're still over there, verse 50 tells us that Joseph of Arimathea was a good and a righteous man. A good and a righteous man. And he is a member of the council that took Jesus, took him in chapter 14 and brought all of these false charges and accusations against him and then delivered him to Pilate. He was a member of that council. But he did not consent to the council's decision, Luke tells us. He did not consent. He knew this was not okay. He knew that what was happening was not a good thing. So in the same way that Pilate compromised, Joseph of Arimathea, I think, did not compromise. He knew the truth. He did not compromise the truth. He did not consent to these false accusations that the rest of his fellow council members brought before Jesus. We also know that he asked for Jesus' body, verse 43. He went before Pilate after Jesus had died, and he asked Pilate for the body. Mark says that he took courage to go ask for the body. And he prepared it for burial. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal necessarily, but the Romans would have left Jesus' body on that cross to rot. That was fitting for a criminal, to crucify him and to leave him on a cross until the birds came and cleaned it up, until it decayed, until maybe the stench was just so bad that nobody could take it anymore, and then they had to take it down. They would have left him there. That was fitting for a criminal. Jesus wasn't a criminal. Joseph of Arimathea knew that. He did not compromise justice the same way that Pilate did. He took a man who was innocent, and although he could not stop his death, he did what he could for him. He took him down off that cross and prepared his body for burial. He was respectful of Jesus, of what he had done. And then he laid Jesus in a tomb. And note that he did this before the start of the Sabbath. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning of the lesson, that this was right up until the start of the Sabbath. It would have started on that Friday evening when sundown came, about 6 p.m. He made sure that Jesus was buried before the start of the Sabbath. Being a Jew, by law, he wouldn't have been able to do anything when the Sabbath came. He's not supposed to do any work. Mark this down, Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 through 23. We're not going to read this one, but think about this. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 through 23. This is a specific law regarding what happens when somebody is hung on a tree. God set this out for the Jews many, many years ago. It said if you hang somebody on a tree, you do not wait until the next day to bury that body. Joseph was following that law. He was doing the righteous thing. He was doing what God had asked the Jews to do. Do you think any of the other council members would have followed Deuteronomy 21? You think they would have gone out and tried to get that body and put it in a tomb before sundown? Doubtful. Joseph did that to follow the law. He did the righteous thing. He did it before sundown so that Jesus' body wouldn't be hanging there for an extra day, for all the world to see and all of the shame that would have come with that. He took him down and he put him in a tomb. He upheld righteousness. It's just kind of odd to me, these two men, one at the beginning of the chapter and one at the end. And the way they approached Jesus was completely different, wasn't it? It's kind of interesting bookends to this story. One man that had no regard, that didn't want the responsibility. And one man that took all of it at the end. That is all that I have for this lesson this morning. There's about a minute left, maybe. Are there any other comments, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why did Jesus perform a lot of miracles in this time? And he has a lot of people believing in him and following him. Why still people want to kill him?
Why do people still want to kill Jesus even though he was a good man? He performed many miracles while he was on this earth. That is a wonderful, wonderful question. The short answer, the council, the chief priests, they were envious of him. They knew that he had sway over these people because he was bringing the truth, and they didn't want to give up their power. That's one answer to that question. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. Next week, John will wrap us up with the book of Mark, and we will start a new quarter after that. Thank you.